We're so glad you're here, and we're going to get started. If you'll bow with me, we'll start with a prayer. Dear Heavenly Father, we just praise you and thank you for this beautiful day. We thank you for the cooler weather. It just feels good. It makes it feel more like fall and more like the season we're about to enter with Thanksgiving and Christmas. And what a reminder to be thankful for all the blessings in our life. We have so many. And we just want to ask you to just continue to lead us, guide us, direct us, keep us on the right path in all that we do. And be with us tonight, and be with those that are still on their way. Help them to get here safely and find a parking place. And just let us enjoy our time together tonight and enjoy this wonderful season of Thanksgiving. We love you, and we pray in Jesus' name. Amen. Amen. All right, and I'm going to ask if you all would stand, and Rusty is going to lead us in the Pledge of Allegiance.
Everybody ready?
Yes, sir.
All right. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic
for which it stands, one nation,
under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you so much, Rusty Kahn. And we're grateful for Rusty, because Rusty's come through a big surgery, and he's doing great, and we are just very, very happy with that. Martha had her battery replaced in her pacemaker today, so that's why she's not here. And I think they keep her at least a night or two at the hospital. So I didn't hear anything to the contrary, so I'm praying she's doing well. And but I'm Barbara Udit, the president of the Historical Society. I sometimes forget to say that. I think everybody knows who I am, but not everybody does. And but we're so glad to have you here. And we're going to get started with our program. And Jim Cox would be here, except he and Lila have been in Europe, and they fly home today. And he was like hoping it might be early enough that he'd get here, but and because you know how that goes with the flights. So I have no idea where he is right now. But we're glad y'all are here. And I want to introduce our speaker tonight is Christian Wagley. Am I saying that right? And he is the coastal organizer for the nonprofit organization Healthy Gulf. And they work on water quality, energy, climate, and endangered species issues along the coast of Northwest Florida and South Alabama. He holds a master's degree in biology and coastal zone studies from the University of West Florida. And I can't wait to hear his program and hear about that whale out in the Gulf. Did anybody else know that there were whales in the Gulf? Well, yeah, you would, Vicki. So let's bring him up with a round of applause. Christian.
Thank you so much. Yeah. I think my technology is, let's see what it's doing here, if we can make it.
I think your computer goes to sleep.
Is that that's what's happening? So once I'm up a lot, then
now
we
it's back on.
don't have an issue, right? So let's see. I mean, we're having this issue where, let's see if it'll stay there. I'm wondering if it's got some kind of a, it was advancing on its own. I wonder if I had it set on like a,
You can have it on.
where it was on its own, show kind of thing. I mean, let's see, it seems to be holding. So just to get things started, kind of transport yourself 60 miles out into the Gulf of Mexico, which if you've never been there, this is what the water looks like. And once you've seen water like that, you never forget it. And if you go out to a place like that, 60 miles out from here, there's a place called the DeSoto Canyon. And there's this magnificent animal living there that's one of the rarest of its type in the world. And it's eking out an existence, fewer than 100 remaining. And this is a magnificent animal, 40 feet long, 60,000 pounds, diving hundreds of feet deep to feed. But it's struggling to survive in a Gulf of Mexico that's really become industrialized over time. It's a very noisy and chaotic place. And these animals need the things that we need. They need some space to live, and they need access to food, and they need quiet, and they need clean air and clean water. And the struggle of this animal is really kind of emblematic of the Gulf of Mexico. It's called the Rice's whale, and it's again, fewer than 100 animals. It lives only in the Gulf of Mexico, And I'm going to use its story at the end to kind of tell a little bit more of the larger story of the Gulf of Mexico. So, Barbara talked about some more personal things that she wanted me to include in my introduction, which I didn't send. I just sent like the professional stuff, but since you're all history folks, I can tell you, I live in a little 1921 bungalow in downtown Pensacola, on one of the last brick streets, and my little house was going to be torn down, and I was able to get it at the end of 1999 and move it about 4.5 blocks to its current location and restore it, and it's been an incredible journey and a lot of fun, and just beautiful features with wood ceilings and just big fat trim, and I retied all the weights in the wall so all the windows work, top sash, bottom sash, I mean, just beautiful stuff. The house would have been built for railroad workers. There was a big rail yard downtown there a few blocks from my house. So the big houses were the engineers. There's several houses near me called Engineers Row, and that's where the engineers lived, right? So they had the big houses. And then the worker folks lived in, my size house, which is about 950 square feet. And they would have walked to work and stuff. So it's a neat place to live and a lot of fun. And a very famous football player lived in my house in high school named Derek Brooks, who's was an All-American in college. He's a Pro Football Hall of Famer and played with the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, and he lives down there and is very active in both business and philanthropy, and he comes back here several times a year and does a lot of philanthropy, stuff with the kids especially. People just love him. He's a great guy. He was an incredible athlete. He was an incredible student. He's just one of those most exceptional people that's ever come out of Pensacola. So interestingly, he lived in my house. When the police came to escort my house down the road, and then the house members picked up the house and pulled it away, there was a big banner under the house that his family had obviously taken to a Florida State football game. It's like, we love you, Derek, whatever. So it was like, I heard it was his house, and then that was the proof. A natural history of the Gulf of Mexico, and really a natural history, environmental history, because a lot of this has to do with humans and our interactions with the Gulf of Mexico as well as we tell this story. So just getting oriented, the red dot is us, and we go from the eastern part in Florida all the way around to Texas to the west, 5 states. And the organization I work for works in all of these states. We're based in New Orleans, but we have people working in all of them. As Barbara said, I live here and I work mostly in Northwest Florida on a variety of issues. But just getting oriented kind of physically and geographically. The Gulf of Mexico really came about, 200 million years ago, all of what are the continents today were all together as one, and as they split apart at some point along the way of that process, the North American landmass and South American landmass split apart, and eventually this void became the Gulf of Mexico that we know today. And so some basic things about that is basically from the area south of Pensacola and then east and south where it says West Florida Escarpment. That area is what we call carbonate. It's an area of limestone. Think of like crushed coral and shell and all that got compressed together over time. And limestone's that, kind of rocky, somewhat soft stuff, but you see it around the springs if you go in central Florida. So a lot of that area in the eastern Gulf is more limestoney. As you go west from Pensacola, it's more muddy because of the influence of the Mississippi River. And so that's real important not only for geology, but also the natural history, because the animals are different in those, and they respond differently in the muddy bottom versus kind of that harder, rocky, carbonate limestone bottom. So that's an important thing. You see salt domes noted on there, and then I think the weird features kind of pockmarking where it says 6B escarpment, I think are actually like collapsed salt domes, or it has something to do with salt domes as well, but they're not. They're no longer domes. I believe they've collapsed or something, and that makes kind of that pockmarked bottom that you see off Texas and Louisiana in there. So, and then you see there's a number of canyons that cut through. I mentioned the DeSoto Canyon off Pensacola, but Mississippi Canyon's one of those, and these are the remains of, as rivers flowed out across the continental shelf when the sea level was much lower during the Ice Age. And if you went to the beach, it would have been way out, 60 miles out or something. And these rivers flowed across and they cut those channels that today we call canyons because they're all submerged. And a little bit more of just the view of the Gulf and some of the depths. I think the depths get to somewhere around 14,000 feet or so, kind of out in that middle, slightly western part. And of course, Mexico, we won't forget our neighbors, and Mexico shares the Gulf as well with the United States, and then Cuba a little bit touching it to the east there as well. And you see some of those features mentioned again, the Florida Escarpment and Mississippi Canyon, DeSoto Canyon I mentioned, which is ours out here where the fishermen like to go and the whales like to live as well. So certainly going back, just looking at native settlement, it's interesting, and I don't work in this space, but they keep moving back the time when humans came into North America, so now they're back to around 20,000 years. It used to be 15,000 years, but they keep finding new evidence, and it keeps going farther back. But on the Gulf Coast, I think it's more like 12,000 years or something like that. That may have slightly changed as well, I'm not sure. And you see examples of some of the different tribes, some of the names we might have heard of from Florida over into Texas that we might be familiar with, Pascagoula being one of them. And these were hunter-gatherer societies. The Gulf just had an incredible bounty that we just can't even imagine today, the amount of richness of fish and shellfish. And it's certainly, we're all reminded of it, even if you walk along the shoreline here in Gulf Breeze, you see those shell middens. Does everybody see those as you're going along? Yeah. And it's pretty easy to find pottery. You're not supposed to dig in those, and I never do, but along the shoreline as they erode, you see those deposits out at the water's edge. And based on the patterns and such, you can kind of tell some time period that they may come from. But that's always fascinating to me, to just think that these were formed from the shocking that went on over many centuries, and just the bounty of our waters here. It's a fraction of what that was today. And we'll talk about that a little bit. Starting out with some of the more European exploration, really the Spanish coming in. Pineda, Alvarez de Pineda was really the one that mapped the Gulf of Mexico first in 1519. And there were a whole flurry of Spanish explorers coming in the early 16th century. Who's read the Gulf? Has anybody read the Gulf? Really? Nobody in this room? Yeah. It's won a Pulitzer Prize. Jack Davis, history professor at the University of Florida. He came here when he was researching the book, and I helped him some. He was nice enough to put my name in it, which is very kind of him. But it is incredible, and it goes into extensive detail about these Spanish expeditions coming into the Gulf. And it gets into the environmental history and some of the things I'm talking about today as well. But it is the book on the Gulf of Mexico, and it touches our area. He talks about Pensacola. He comes here and talks about the a lot of the pollution issues in the 60s and 70s and some other things. So you all as historians have gotta have it. Oh yeah. And he's written something else. I'm not sure what his newest other book is now, but anyway, we've hosted him in the area to speak about it a couple times. I'm sorry y'all missed that if you didn't make it, but yeah, Pineda. And so the interesting thing, and you see his map here. This is his map. This is the first map of the Gulf of Mexico, and you can kind of see the rough outline of it, the rough shape of the Gulf. Kind of, that was the best that they could do at that time, right? But that was the first one. And when I look at those sailing ships there, what it makes me think of is actually Jack in the book talks about a subsequent expedition after Pineda was, I think it was Narvaez, and what stood out to me was that the Gulf of Mexico would have had a bounty in that time that we just cannot even fathom how rich it would have been with fish and shrimp and oysters, just thousands of times greater than anything we can imagine today. And yet these Spanish expedition, they were starving. And they were surrounded by all of that, and they were starving because they somehow weren't people that were used to eating those type of resources, and they insisted on, I guess, the beef and the things that they were eating back in Europe, and they just did not adapt to that. And yet, of course, the natives, that's what they ate from, and they raided the natives and took food from them and such, but they just never quite adapted to that, and that was just amazing. That was one of the most amazing things in this whole book, was to be sailing through the Gulf of Mexico with a bounty that we cannot even imagine, and to be starving, because it was literally all around them. And so it's a very strange account. But you got to read The Gulf by Jack Davis. You all will love it. So I think one of the ways to tell some of the environmental and natural history of the Gulf through some of the animals that we know well. One is red snapper. Pensacola was the red snapper capital of the world. I don't know if it's still necessarily considered that, but it certainly was for a period of time. And it's a classic example of, like we did with everything. We did it with the longleaf pine, and we do it with most things. We overharvested. And so the history of it was, in the beginning, they were catching these red snapper right off Pensacola, and then they kind of fished that out, and they had to go east over off of Cape San Blas, Port St. Joe, that area there, and then they kind of fished that out, and they had to go farther around off Tampa. And you see the years here kind of posted on there in the late 19th century. And then into the 20th century, and really the last of the fishery up into the mid-20th century, down off the Campeche banks and Yucatan down that way. And they actually would sail, I think it was a 3-day sail from Pensacola down there in those smacks that they call them. And I don't know, you all may know this, they debate the name of the smacks. Some say it came from the smacking of the tails of the fish, because they had live holds, so they would pump seawater in there and throw the fish in there live before they had refrigeration, before they had ice, and bring the fish back alive. And so there was this, smacking of tails in there. And so that was one thought. But once of course, those fish were all canned early on, and then once refrigeration came, and they could ice them, and then the railroad came in, they were able to start shipping those fish off to Chicago, New York, these places. And I mean, you were big time if you were in Chicago or New York and you could eat fresh red snapper from the Gulf of Mexico. That was a big deal. But we didn't manage fisheries then. You just took whatever you wanted, and so they took too much. They fished it out, and the catches dropped so low that by the 80s it bottomed out. And there's a lot of controversy now you see in the news, and I don't fish for red snapper, and our organization's not involved in these issues, the allocation issues, who gets what percentage of the fish. You hear the recreational fishermen always complaining, the season's too short, or they can't catch enough. What they're trying to do is manage for the big female fish, and there's a term the biologists use, big fat fecund female. Fecund is the term for basically fertility that scientists use, okay? And this chart shows that the younger fish produce just a tiny fraction of the eggs that the older females do. And so they're trying to manage the fishery, and that's what creates a lot of controversy, is the fishermen want to catch more, inevitably. And they're trying to manage it so they can get more of those fish to live long enough that they get into those multiple decades of years, because they produce so much more offspring than the young fish do. They want those fish in there. And so big fat fecund female is kind of funny. That's how the biologists talk about it. But I thought that was important to the history of the fish. Overfishing is illegal in America now. As of 1979, we passed the Magnuson-Stevens Act, the federal level on that, set into place all this sustainable fishery management. Before that, we overfished everything, and now that's technically illegal. And the argument is over, whose numbers you use. People will complain the government's numbers aren't right, whatever. And so there's a lot of that. I'm not in that space. There's a lot of statistics and how they collect and count all that. But it's an important part of the history of the Gulf of Mexico, certainly the red snapper. And as we do with so many natural resources, we just took too much. We didn't know enough to know that it could ever, we thought it was inexhaustible, and of course it was not. Another one that kind of tells that story, that's a little closer to home as well here in our coastal bays, is oysters. And so our oysters have been decimated by about 90% across the Gulf of Mexico region, and that includes in Pensacola Bay. And the oysters are so important. This is where the reefs are still in our bay system. And they're what we call brackish water, not too fresh, not too salt, but kind of in between. And so if you all go up into our bay system and you're familiar with Escambia Bay and then East Bay, so on either side of Garcon Point and Garcon Peninsula is where you're going to still find some oyster reefs. And there's just a little bit of a chart here I put in just since 1980. You see the drop off of the catch. And we were second in Florida for years. Apalachicola was always by far, they produced far more oysters than we did, but their fishery is so sick over there. They're, I think it may be year 4 of a 5-year moratorium where you're not allowed to catch any oysters. I mean, it's the ultimate worst option of any fishery managers to have to close a fishery completely. But it's totally collapsed over there. Ours has really collapsed as well. The estuary program here, which I work a lot with, the Pensacola and Perdido Bays Estuary Program, has a goal to restore 1,500 acres of oysters in our bays over the next, I think, 10 years. It's a big, bold goal. It'll take everything they can to reach it. We still don't have the water quality clean enough. This new construction and dirt roads wash sediment into the bay. It smothers the reefs. That's a big, big problem with them. And so much of the shell has been taken out that the oysters need, the baby oysters need something hard to attach to, which is the old oyster shells. And that's why if you go to a restaurant, you see those programs now where they collect the shell and they get the shell back out there again. And that's what these people are doing, is they're seeding a reef with some shell. So if you don't have shell out there, you're not going to have more oysters. But oysters are, obviously we love to eat them, and if you like to fish, then you'll find a lot of fish around them, and so fishermen will seek them out. But they shift an ecosystem in an amazing way. The way they filter the water and cleanse it. They make the water clearer, and when the water's clearer, the grass beds grow better. And the grass beds are basically 90% gone from our bays as well. And so between oysters and seagrass, those are like the main ecological habitats in our bays, and they're both mostly gone. But if we can get the oysters back, then I think we can get the bay back. But you can watch for opportunities to maybe get involved with some of these projects and such in the years ahead. But that's an incredible effort to see the oysters come back.
Oh, I will back up. Let me think here. Do you participate in this right here? I know you do, but do you help with the oysters putting a shield back into the bay?
I have done that before. I mean, I'm not real active in their program, but I know about it.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, I didn't know if you, okay, all right, you just answered it. Cause what I was gonna do, I was gonna volunteer. See, I volunteered at Gulf Power about 10 years ago when they did the bayfront.
Yeah, yeah, yep.
And we spent, gosh, I can't tell you how many weeks we spent down there putting oyster shells back
Yeah.
down. And I was gonna get with you and volunteer again, if you need help.
Yeah, so I would go to the Pensacola and Perdido Bay's Estuary Program website. You should see something on there, I think, about it if they have opportunities. Have y'all heard of that Pensacola and Perdido Bay's Estuary
No.
Program? And I can send something to Barbara later if you want, and you can include it in a subsequent newsletter or something. That would be the place. They're the group that will be overseeing all
Okay.
that, and they can get you connected. I'm sure they'd love to have the help.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So just as we move toward getting toward the end here, another part of the huge history, not only culturally, environmentally, economically, is the arrival of oil and gas drilling in the Gulf of Mexico in the late 1930s, I think first off of Texas. This is really probably the biggest environmental issue in the Gulf of Mexico. It's a very dirty business. There's spills every day. Sometimes we have the catastrophic spills like the 2010 Deepwater Horizon disaster. It also creates a lot of noise, seismic. They do explosions to try to find new deposits. It's just a very, very messy, noisy business, and it has some pretty negative impacts in the Gulf of Mexico. And it's really changed the face of the Gulf of Mexico in so many ways, but mainly to the west of us. Florida is the only state that doesn't have oil and gas drilling, and so therefore we don't have all that nasty stuff on land over there. It's covered over with petrochemical facilities and refineries, and you have terrible, terrible air and water pollution and communities that are suffering from that. And it's documented. You've heard the term Cancer Alley. That is scientifically documented. It is dirtier air and water, and people definitely have a worse health outcome because of that. Documented by scientific research. It's not just people complaining about it. So that's part of the reason when I mentioned the whales earlier. The whales like it over here because it's relatively quiet. We're the only coast that's not industrialized. So oil and gas has dramatically changed the face of the Gulf of Mexico, and you really should see it peaking at some point in the not too distant future as clean energy comes on. Today, when they build a power plant, they build solar and wind. They don't build coal and natural gas plants anymore because it's cheaper to build them from solar and wind. It's simply cheaper to do that. So there's going to be a phase. It'll take 30, 40 years for all of that to phase out. And there'll probably still always be a little bit out there for some other incidental uses, but for energy, it's all shifting, and that's a shift that's inevitable, and it's going to result in a dramatically cleaner and healthier Gulf of Mexico in so many ways. But oil and gas is a big part of the Gulf of Mexico. The other thing is actually not what happens in the water, but what happens on land, and that's the dead zone that occurs in the Gulf of Mexico every summer. That's caused by, and that's really off the mouth of the Mississippi River, Louisiana, and over into Texas. But it's caused by runoff largely from agriculture in the American Midwest. It comes down the Mississippi River, a lot of it corn growing, a lot of it corn being grown for ethanol, which doesn't make any sense, and the only reason they do it is because it's subsidized, and the Republicans want to get rid of it, the Democrats want to get rid of it, and nobody can get rid of it because it's got such a powerful lobby. But the ethanol doesn't make any sense at all in any way, but the subsidy has been impossible to get rid of. So part of it's for that, and then a lot of that is feed for animals, for cattle and such. Very little of it goes to people directly, it goes to livestock and such. But those are nutrient-heavy crops, corn especially, and a lot of that runs off the farm fields, finds its way down the Mississippi River, and fuels this growth of tiny plankton in the water, plant plankton, we call phytoplankton. And so they explode every summer down there, and then as they die, the bacteria decompose them and rob the water of oxygen, and so it creates this low oxygen zone over thousands of square miles. And if you could swim, you get out of the way. If you can't swim, then you die. If you're an oyster in that, then you potentially die. So this has been documented since the early 80s. And
That's not red tide, is it?
no, it's not red tide, but there's some. They're both animal. Those are both plankton that are. It's plankton that's causing this, but they're not a plankton that's toxic or harmful the way red tide is. But they're both plant plankton that feed on nutrients. And wherever there's humans, nutrients leak from our societies. What runs off our streets and our lawns and comes out of sewage treatment plants and what leaks out of automobiles, all these things are nutrients. Nutrients sound good, and nutrients are good to an extent, But we have too many nutrients in these waterways, and it turns waters that should be relatively clearer and bluer, it turns them browner and greener and murkier, and that's what starts to kind of block the sunlight into the water and kind of cause a whole cascade of negative impacts. It's really, I think, the best analogy from kind of using medical terminology is, we used to have acute issues in our waterways in the 1960s when the rivers and bays and everything were so dirty that fish washed up dead by the thousands and millions at a time. Cuyahoga River caught on fire. Those were acute issues. Today, most of our issues are chronic. So they're just a slow, it's like having diabetes instead of a heart attack. The heart attack's gonna kill you right away. The diabetes is just sort of this slow malaise. That's kind of what our waterways have typically. And it's a little harder to tell the story when that happens, but that's kind of been the transition. We've taken care of a lot of the worst things, immediate things, but we have these kind of general malaise. But the dead zone is certainly one that kind of dominates much of the Gulf of Mexico, and it's part of the story, part of the history of the Gulf. So, and another one before I just wrap up with the whale is something going on in the Gulf of Mexico and really every body of water worldwide is that the level of the sea is rising. Now, this is not new. We had an ice age, and the level of the ocean and all of our little coastal bays here has been rising for about the last 15 or 18,000 years or so. What's happening now is it's accelerating dramatically, and that's because of climate change. And so we have a tide gauge at the Port of Pensacola that's been there since 1923. So we have a neat 100 years of data now. If you go down there to the port, you can look over and you'll see a little sign, and there's a little station there, and it's been continuously measuring the level of the water there since 1923, and that's what's reflected here. It rose about 10 inches during the last 100 years. So this is 10 inches vertically, which depending on how the shoreline is, it can go back a long way or it can go back not at all, depending on how gentle or how steep the shoreline is. But so 10 inches in the last 100 years. What we're gonna see now is about the same rise in the next 30 years, so about a tripling of that rise. And that's pretty much baked in. So that's gonna be, I know like if you go out on Santa Rosa Island right now, they're struggling with what to do with Baby Beach, and that beach down there, to the east, where a lot of people go on the Santa Rosa Sound side there. And these are the kinds of things that are going to be happening more and more. It's just issues along shorelines as they're retreating more rapidly. And we have to decide: do we renourish? Do we put a wall up? Do we abandon it? What do we do? So that's another big thing. The worst of this, of course, is happening off the mouth of the Mississippi River in Louisiana, where the whole Mississippi Marsh and that delta is washing away dramatically. That's because of sea level rise, but even more so, it's because the Mississippi has been altered and the sediment doesn't flow out into the mouth anymore. It just dumps off on the continental shelf. It used to spread out across the delta and nourish all that marsh, so it could keep rising and keep healthy. That doesn't happen anymore. And you also have thousands of miles of canals that were dredged into the Mississippi River Delta to allow access for oil and gas drilling, and that allows salt water to come in, and it killed the vegetation and has opened up a lot of it as well. So the Mississippi River mouth is really declining dramatically. I forget how many hundreds of square miles a year or something is washing away. So much more pronounced than what we have here. So we'll wrap up with the rice as well, which again I think is kind of emblematic of the Gulf of Mexico and the struggle, of people and nature and commerce and all these things in the Gulf, and it kind of wraps up that story. When we say we have whales in the Gulf of Mexico, that's what people say, and yes we do. And this really hit the news in January of 2021 when this whale was introduced and made the news as a fully distinct species. So we've been working on these whales for 15 years or so. Scientists had known about them since the 1960s and been working on them. They were believed to be a subspecies of another whale called the Brutus whale that ranges around the world. But scientists thought this might be its own distinct species, but scientists think they need the evidence. And so that came when one unfortunately came to shore dead, which is when you have fewer than 100 animals remaining, even one death is absolutely catastrophic to the population. But one came in dead down in the Everglades, and they took a unique opportunity to study it more closely. They actually buried it in compost and basically composted it to get a clean skeleton. So they did this in a very methodical way. And then they were able to compare the skull, the morphology of the skull, to other whales and determine that it was a distinct species, along with some new DNA work as well. So both of those two lines of evidence were combined and published in a paper that came out in January 2021 that said, this is a fully distinct species, and they named it after Dale Rice, who was a whale researcher back in the 1960s that wrote the first paper about this whale. So that's when most people heard, like I said, there were hundreds and hundreds of articles all over the internet and in your local newspaper and everything about this whale, and that's when most people first heard about it.
How did it die, do you know?
There was a piece of plastic from a bucket lodged in its stomach that believed to cause a long
Wow.
emaciation. This is a little bit about them, where they live and such. So they really like that area where it drops off. That darker band there is their favorite place to be. That's where they mostly live. It's between 100 and 400 meters, so 300 to 1,200 feet deep, where the shelf drops off. Remember we were looking at the shelf earlier? That's where they like to live. That's where their food is, and that's where they're mostly found. And that's part of the challenge with them, is that we don't see them close to shore. And because of that, most of us are probably never going to see them. And so it makes it a little bit harder. We don't get as many photos. It's a little harder to think about something that you don't see. But it's possible. Humans, there's a sense of awe about animals, and we all love animals that we don't ever go. I mean, I grew up loving big cats, right? So big lions in Africa. I've never seen one in the wild, and I probably never will, but I still love them, and I want them to be protected. And humans have the ability to do that, to care about things that are bigger than us and things that we may not ever see. So most likely none of us will ever see a rhesus whale out there, but they're there. The scientists are listening for them. They have recording devices out there that are listening and hearing their calls, and they go out on expeditions to try to count them and to document them and such. So anyway, that's kind of where they live. They like the Eastern Gulf, but they are spending about a third of the days in the Western Gulf, even though it's such a chaotic mess over there. This is what a whale has to navigate if they go basically west of Pensacola, especially into Texas and Louisiana. It's thousands of miles of pipelines and platforms. It's constant vessel traffic, constant noise from seismic explosions and vessel traffic, and just the daily operations of rigs. And so despite all of that, the whales are over there about a third of the days of the year. They like it over here better because, again, it's quiet and not industrialized, but they are somehow trying to navigate that some. That's really true. And I've heard from somebody here that talks about flying over the Gulf of Mexico, and it's lit up at night. It's just lit up like a city out there. When you go. I haven't had that experience, but it's pretty dramatic. So of course we have the occasional catastrophic event like the 2010 Deepwater Horizon disaster. For the whales, that was catastrophic. It led to a 22% decline in the population. And these are animals that can't afford to even lose one. I think they calculated one animal every 14 years in order to just sustain the population. They have to just they can't be harmed, by any of our accidents and such, and maintain their population and grow and recover. Really the biggest threat that something can be done about more immediately is ship traffic. Ships can accidentally strike them. And it's increasingly common worldwide that ships are having to slow down as they approach shore in many, many places. On the east coast of the US, there's a whale called the right whale. There's about 350 of those left. They're in the news a lot. And they've had seasonal slowdown zones over there since 2008. And this is from Florida up into Maine. The whales migrate back and forth. Our whales don't migrate. They stay in the Gulf. They don't leave the Gulf, and they don't really migrate within the Gulf. They're just kind of there all the time. So increasingly shipping companies, big international shipping companies like Maersk, which I think is from Denmark, they're increasingly used to this in other places, but it's never been a thing on the Gulf Coast. So when it was first proposed that there might be a slowdown zone offshore, it's become a huge controversy and a lot of anger and pushback from port and shipping. But you can go online at any time to marinetraffic.com and see where all the ships are and where they're going. It is fascinating. And these are just some kind of like heat maps to see. And we know where the major ports are, Houston, New Orleans, Tampa, and you see those kind of lit up. And you see the Eastern Gulf, not a lot, right? So again, relatively quiet over here, not industrialized, a safer place for the whales. But we had proposed some slowdown zones offshore. Those have not moved forward for now, and it's a very controversial thing. But again, when you first bring something forward, it's always, when the first time you hear something, it sounds the worst. And I think the more you hear it, or the more you hear the science behind it, the more you see the justification, how it works. I think a lot of that opposition hopefully will go away, but it's going to be a long-term process. The oil and gas and all the impacts from that's not going to go away right away. But the slowing ships down can be done more immediately. When you look at marinetraffic.com, most of the ships are going like 14 knots. The typical slowdown is to 10 knots. So that's not really a big difference. So again, it's building awareness around that and hoping that can move forward eventually. But there's been a lot of pushback. We have multiple bills in Congress right now that would make it so NOAA can't spend even a penny on the whales. They can't move forward with any restrictions. There's a number of bills that we're working to hope are defeated and do not move forward. Because here's the fact of the matter, the Endangered Species Act is now 51 years old. It's the law of the land. Americans, 51 years ago, we enshrined that in our law to say we love and respect the plants and animals that we share this nation with, and we will not allow them to go extinct due to our actions. And that's the law. And there's a scientific process that tries to take the politics out of that, where biologists look at these, figure out where these animals or plants are and what needs to be done to protect them. And so, our position is really to keep the kind of political meddling out of that, because it's the scientists that know best, and it's a process that does work if we allow it to work. So one of the things we've relied on is these videos and photos from fishermen, especially, who do go out offshore. You remember, these whales are fairly far out there, and the only people that really go out there are these deep sea fishermen and such. One of them is one of your neighbors here in Gulf Breeze. Does anybody know Ben Renfro, Dr. Ben Renfro? I think he's pediatric specialty in neurology. Wonderful, wonderful man. He and his buddy saw the whales, took video. I helped to get it into the Pensacola News Journal, and that was a nice article that came from that. And he was kind enough last fall to take myself, and this is a crew from National Public Radio that's done probably the best story that's ever been done on these whales. It's about 7 minutes long. It's very in-depth. They came down from Washington. We waited. We had this beautiful October day. That's where I got that blue picture of that water earlier out in the DeSoto Canyon. And he took us, at his expense, way out there. And we had a magnificent day of just great conversation and fellowship. We fished. We went back to his house and ate the fish, at the end of the day. I mean, it was just an incredible experience, to go out there like that. Very kind and generous man. He's part of the Renfro, the Pecan family. Yeah. So very, very wonderful man. So that was a real great experience for me. But we need these fishermen to report these sightings to help understand them. Fortunately, what's happened now is the fishermen are afraid that bringing attention to the whale and knowledge is going to bring restrictions to the area, so they have shut down they don't report. And if somebody puts up a picture, the others pressure them to take it down. And so that's unfortunate, because I had established some good relationships with some of them. I don't think Dr. Renfro would be that way, but unfortunately a lot of others have gotten into that space. And so if speed restrictions came in, it would just be larger vessels, like 65 feet and larger. It wouldn't affect most of the fishermen, but they have unfortunately gotten afraid of regulation, and so they're not making reports anymore, and that's unfortunate. I mentioned that since the whales are so far out and we don't see them very often, we don't have a whale culture here. If you go to a place like on the West Coast or up in the Northeast, you see whale stuff, right? And you see, there'll be whale watching boats, and it's part of the culture, because these are whales that come close to shore, people see them, they experience them. Fortunately, we don't here. So I'm working with a lot of other great folks to try to create that culture here. And one of the things we did last April, we had the first ever Gulf Coast Whale Festival out here on Pensacola Beach. So we brought, art and music and science and all that together. And, we're not going to have a live whale there, right? That's impossible. And most of these people, again, are never going to see them, but we can tell the story through what? Through puppetry and art and storytelling and all these things that went on there. And it was a great event. It's going to be...
Is that like a balloon, a blow-up?
Well, the kids at the Navarre Beach Marine Science Station, who are high school students in Santa Rosa County, made that whale. Wow. And inflated it, yeah. So that's going to happen again Saturday, April 12 of 2025 out on Pensacola Beach. So come see us out there. It's a lot of fun. And just continue to build that culture around whales. More and more artists are picking up the cause of the whales. And that just happens organically. Well, artists are always looking for something new to work with, right? And they've learned about the whales, and so they're painting them, and they're doing murals, and they're doing things with them, and that's really exciting, because you can't just rely on the science to tell the story. You need everything working together, and artists make a great contribution to that.
California, the Whalen Walls, all those.
Okay,
Whalen, W-A-Y-L-A-N.
Heard about that, yeah. Yeah, we have an artist that painted one of the racist whales at a restaurant over in Santa Rosa Beach. It's about an hour and a half east of here. So anyway, that's a lot of fun. And then we have a new educational poster that you can download from ourgulfwhale.org if you want to print your own copy. And I'm getting them put in like visitor centers and marine science stations and various things like that along the Gulf Coast. But it tells the whole story in a beautiful way of the whales and what they look like and what they eat and the threats to them and such. And this was done by wildlife artist Dawn Wetherington, who's very famous in Florida. She's done a ton of wildlife illustrations and such. But you can find that at ourgulfwhale.org. And then these are some of the things that we're working on and that people can do. The Biden administration actually right now is considering they could potentially do a permanent moratorium on drilling in the Eastern Gulf off Florida. That's a pretty popular thing. Florida does not want drilling. It's we know that's a threat to our sandy beaches and our tourism economy and such. So You know, we work with a lot of national groups that are lobbying, in this case, the outgoing Biden administration, to try to do something. Most presidents do, they have some broad authority, and there's something called the Antiquities Act, and there's some other things that they use. They do a lot of like designating like national monuments and marine sanctuaries and things, and a lot of them will do that at the end of their term. I think they've all pretty much done it. Obama did it, Bush did it, like they all will do it, and they'll designate certain areas of the ocean, you know, off limits to certain things. And so I know President Biden's considering those things, and that's one of the things that he could potentially do that some of us have been lobbying for. But there's some other things here as well going on, people can do, supporting the speed restrictions if those come forward, and some other things as we transition our communities away from the oil and gas drilling in the Gulf and toward cleaner, renewable forms of energy. And so I do remind everybody, you know, the whales have they've definitely become a flashpoint and a lot of controversy, but we live with endangered species every day here on the Gulf Coast. Some of our most iconic animals, these are all animals that have protections, and we just make a little space for them, and we adapt some of what we do. Life goes on, right? Business doesn't totally shut down. These are things like the Gulf sturgeon, like the manatees. We have 5 species of sea turtles here. They all have protections, just like the whales, which actually need some expanded protections. And we've learned to coexist, and we can live, we make space, we, you know, slow down our boats, we don't do beach nourishment when the turtles are there. They do it in times when the turtles are not there. So things adjust, they pivot, but they don't necessarily stop. And the brown pelican is a success story because they were on the endangered list, and they have recovered and been removed from the list because the Endangered Species Act can work if it's given the chance to work. So that's a good success story. Bald eagle is another one, of course. And just leave you with the best photo that's ever been taken yet of the rice as well. This just came out 2 weeks ago. We really need like that David Attenborough style epic documentary to tell their story, because we don't have that yet. We have a little bit of video, some photos, but this one was just taken this summer, and it's the best photo I've seen yet of a rice as well. There's also really cool, if you go to, I can send you the link or something, but on NOAA.gov, when they got this, they also did, they're doing temporary tags on them with drones, so the drone flies out over the whale, and there's this great video. They drop the tag, you know, and it just suction cups onto the whale's back, and it stays on for like 12 to 36 hours. They don't do any permanent because they're afraid of hurting the whales and opening it up for infection, and they don't want to take any chance with an animal that's so rare. So there's none of that kind of tagging that will ever happen anytime soon. They'll only do those temporary ones, and then you have the dilemma of how do you get it on there. They usually try to come up on them and just poke it on from behind, but now with the drones, it's amazing to watch them drop that down, and it just sticks right on. And that way they can study their dive patterns, how often do they breathe, how deep do they go, how do they move around. It's really, you can see those movements, and that's really fascinating. So I'll leave it there, and happy to take any questions.
So,
yes, sir.
I can look it up. I took your picture, but what do they eat? What do the rices whales eat?
Yeah,
so they eat on the East Coast, but off the cliff. But what are they looking for?
They mostly eat a fish called the silver rag driftfish, which nobody would ever know about because there's no commercial fishery for it. But they do what's called a lunge feeding, so they're diving down deep, hundreds of feet down, and there's schools of those fish, and they'll go through with their mouth open and grab thousands at a time. And it's a fish that's very high in fat, and so we know that what fat is calories. And it's believed that the whales are willing to expend all that energy and go farther down to get this food because it offers a big return on their energy investment because it's so fat, it's such a fatty fish. So that's mostly what they're specializing, and they eat some other stuff in there as well, but it's mainly this fish called the silver rag driftfish, yeah.
And then do you know why, or do we know why they go from the east to the west for a third of the year? I mean, you said
No, I don't. No, they don't really know. They're not believed to migrate per se. Where it's not like they all go to one place. I don't know if we would consider them to just be more random movements, you know, or what. There's no real defined migration per se.
Following food?
But yeah, I mean, I would just expect that, you know, following food, following mates, following what the others are doing just takes them into different places. And so right now we know about a third of the day is off the western Gulf. We also know that one map I showed you showed in a lighter color suspected habitat off Mexico. There just hasn't been research down there, but the same drop off, the same features are there, and whales have been seen down there that they think are these, but there just hasn't been the science done down there yet, so they don't want to say for sure, but they suspect they could be down there, or likely down there as well. So Well, thank you all so much. I really appreciate the chance to be with you.
Very good presentation.
And I'll leave, I've got a few, I've got just brochures on our organization, but I've got handouts on the whales as well that I'll have, and you can take those home if you wanna read more.
Yeah.
And we have something for you too, Christian.
Oh my goodness.
Oh, my goodness.
Well, thank you so much. I already ate two and I love them, so.
I'll share these, because otherwise I'll eat them all.
Well,
I'll share
the
these with
group
friends.
here has plenty, but you can share them with whoever.
Let's give Christian another round of applause. Thank you so much. That was wonderful.
Very good, Christian, very good.
That was interesting,
Yeah.
and I didn't know about the sturgeon being, endangered. And that's nice to know the pelicans are not, so that's all good news. So, oh, and